Okay, so this will start the economic history theoretical concepts, lecture notes. I'm going to look at, the first part will be looking at what is economic history, what's the difference between economics and history. Different types of history writing and research. Then we'll look at a little, some types of economic analysis, methodological dualism or versus the scientific method, or deduction versus empirical, where you're treating under the scientific method, you're treating social sciences kind of the same as physical sciences. And so that'll be the first thing we'll talk about. So I'll share my screen and we'll discuss that. So this will be part one. Okay, part one of theory. So what is economic history? It's right here, the intersection of economics, history, and politics. You could also add philosophy or methodology. Is that historiography, the whole idea behind writing of history, what is history, is part of the study of it. And so you have economic history, history of economics. Otherwise known as the history of economic thought. History of economic thought. So economic history is when you're looking at using the tools of economics, especially supply and demand, as we looked at last time. Using the tools of economics to explain what happened in history and why. And so that's economic history, is using economic theory to understand the past. But the history of economic thought is something different. History of economic thought is looking at the progress or non-progress, or whatever your view is, either a progressive or regressive research program over time. In other words, what have economists thought over time at different periods of time through today? And both of those are, economic history and history of economic thought, are specialized fields in economics, like macro or micro economics, or industrial organization, or money and banking. So one of my fields is in history of economic thought. And then we'll look at what's the difference between economics and history. Well, history attempts to describe what happened, just to understand it. Just to capture a picture of what happened using secondary sources and primary sources, journals, government records, the stones that they had in Baghdad, cuneiform, and then dates. So the key thing about history writing is using dates and sources. If you ever look in the newspaper and they show a painting, that this painting is going to be sold for X amount of dollars, and they don't give you a date of when the painting was done, then you know they're not a very good art historian, for example. And then economics attempts to explain what happened and why. And economics also makes assumptions about human behavior in order to make predictions. So I think I'll stop sharing my screen and show this. We looked at this last time in the supply and demand for higher education. We'll do that again. So these are the behavioral assumptions that economics makes to try to explain what happened. So here's the market for higher ed in the USA. Price, quantity. So this is the main assumption in economics that all economists agree on. And if you don't agree on this, I believe you're not an economist. I don't know, I haven't written any great books on economic methodology or theory or education, but I've been told that what is the common pre-analytical concept that economists all believe in, and somebody who I respected highly said that the demand curve is downward sloping. In other words, people want more of something if the price is going down. Right? Now, the left-wing economists, they don't agree. Well, some left-wing economists don't agree that supply is upward sloping. In other words, you're willing to supply more when the price goes up. For these left-wing economists, the labor force, Marx divides the world into labor and capital. The labor force is surplus. They don't have any political power. So the supply curve for left-wing economists in the labor market, not higher ed, but labor market, is that supply is horizontal because the worker, so we're all workers, but this special Marxian category, worker versus capital, the worker has to work no matter what the salary is. And then so this, of course, gives an excuse for all kinds of government interventions. But we'll just hold to the position that supply will go up if the price goes up. And then we looked at last time to say, well, we know that tuition and healthcare costs are going up 2 or 3 times inflation than the rest of the economy. So then we can look at the underlying reason why higher ed. So I guess there's been $10 billion written off on student loans ever since the current administration has been in office. So if you get college students indebted and owing you a favor, and then you forgive their loans, well, then you've got someone to vote for you for life, right? So you have this divisive mechanism in order to create classes and then use government power to then recognize those classes in order for political gain. So if we ask, if everybody in the United States wants a higher education, is able to get it, oh, you can't see that. Well, you'll be able to see, can you see that?
Yeah.
Oh, you see there, okay.
Yeah.
Then we asked why would the state intervene? And then Souls rule, the state intervened. The first law of politics, first law of economics is that resources are scarce. The first law of politics is to ignore the first law of economics. So then you try to provide things to people voting now and pass along the debt and devalued currency till later. So when you subsidize, create incentives for people to go to college by doing government guaranteed loans, you're shifting out the demand as you're making special treatment under law, in this case, loans, direct government loans under Team Blue, and then loans that are underwritten or guaranteed by Team Red from banks. So when they're subsidizing or incentivizing students with college loan programs, well, then tuition increases and you're getting more into college, and then therefore more people going to college means a devalued diploma because more people by definition are going to college. So an example of using economic reasoning to explain current events is using, in this case, supply and demand for tuition, or the supply and demand to look at the higher education market, and then the way special interests are created through using the rule of law. And of course, there's a debate in the United States about how much power the Congress has been given the administration, especially in terms of declaration of war. So the reason supply can't shift out is because, and lowering price again, is because of certification. Government certification, licensing, occupational licensing. It's hard to, under many rules and regulations to it. So the Department of Education and then the certified universities have an incentive not to allow competition so that they can get these above normal revenue flows. So that's an example of using the idea of assumptions, in this case, supply curve shifting down, to be able to then understand history in order to predict. So you can predict if you subsidize tuition, that the price is going to go up, and then you can predict that that'll create special interest groups. And then you can predict that those special interest groups will then get treated well under the rule of law. It's the old divide and conquer strategy. And of course, then one of the underlying consequences is those who do go to college make more money than those that don't. So the people who are paying for the forgiven student loans of the educated are in general the uneducated. So then there's different types of history writing. So the main type of history writing we will call political history. That's when you're looking at the political base, the kingdom, the nation state, the city state, and then looking at it from telling the story of the governance, of the political aspects of the political history. And that's what most history has been. And then you get alternative types of history called bottom-up history, where you're writing from the people on up. And Howard Zinn is, or the story of one person at a given place and time, or this is also known as working class history, or popular history, or cultural history. When you're not so concerned with political power and the exercise of that and recording that, but more how does that affect people in a day-to-day situation. And we can also have another type, which is called the great, Carlyle called it great man, but we can call it a great person. That history is made by individuals exercising it like a hero or something like that. And so that would be the great person theory of history. So Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. Has anybody read that, Howard Zinn? No? Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. Very good. But you have to keep in mind that it's just Marxist history. So you have to look at other sources, different views of the same source, of the same event or period. Okay, then on the types of economic analysis. So this is deductive when you're using logic and rhetorical arguments to make a point. It's obvious that supply, common sense tells you that the supply curve or the demand curve is downward sloping. You don't need to get a bunch of data to do that. It just makes sense. And then a lot of what you do in economics and the sciences, first thing, you should never trust a tenured professor. and never trust a tenured bureaucrat. That's the first thing in skepticism of the Enlightenment. So it's about your rhetorical method, your ability to sell the argument, tell the story. And then the other type is mainstream, or by far the majority type of economics, where you put out a thesis and try to disprove it. So, for example, Keynesian economics was refuted in the 1970s because there was high inflation and high unemployment. Whether or not we're going to be facing that again, we can decide it's either falsified or not falsified. But if it doesn't give us the result we want, then we can easily make up other reasons why it didn't occur the way we wanted. So that's why I personally prefer the deductive method. But all models are useful depending on what problem you're trying to solve. Okay, so that will be the end of part 1 of our economic history theoretical concepts. Thank you.